I still remember the day my father told me he was getting married again. My mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and the house had felt empty ever since. I was still trying to understand life without her when my father sat me down at the dining table one evening. He looked nervous. "I've met someone," he said quietly. I tried to smile, but something inside me felt heavy. A few months later, my stepmother moved into our house. First, she acted kind. She smiled often and spoke gently whenever my father was around. But when he wasn't there, something about her felt different. She watched everything, every conversation, every decision, every small detail about the house and our family. One thing quickly became clear. She cared a lot about my father's wealth. My father had built a successful business over many years. Everyone in the family knew he had a large estate, investments, and property. And because I was his only child, everyone assumed I would inherit most of it one day. But my stepmother didn't seem happy about that. I began noticing small comments. "Families need sons," she once said while we were eating dinner. My father laughed it off. But I noticed the way she looked at him when she said it. It wasn't a joke. Months passed, and one day she announced exciting news. She was pregnant. My father was overjoyed. He hugged her and thanked God again and again. But something about the moment didn't feel right. I didn't know why yet. But deep inside, a quiet voice in my mind whispered something strange. Something about this story wasn't true. The pregnancy changed everything in the house. My father became more protective of my stepmother. He made sure she rested often and gave her anything she asked for. She seemed to enjoy the attention. But I noticed something strange. She began treating me very differently. Before the pregnancy, she had at least pretended to be kind to me. Now she barely spoke to me unless my father was present. When he was around, she acted warm and caring. When he left the room, her expression turned cold. One evening I overheard her talking on the phone. She was speaking quietly in the living room while she thought I was upstairs. "Once the baby comes, everything will change," she said. I stopped halfway down the stairs. Something about her tone sounded secretive. "He needs a son. Once that happens, the inheritance will be secured." My heart started beating faster. Inheritance? Why was she talking about inheritance? Before I could hear more, she ended the call. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her words. Over the next few weeks, her behavior became even stranger. She began visiting a clinic in another part of the city. She never allowed my father to come along. When he offered to drive her, she always refused. "It's just routine checkups," she would say. But something about the situation didn't feel normal. And then one evening, I saw something that made my suspicion grow even stronger. Car dropped her off in front of the house. It wasn't a taxi. And the man driving it wasn't someone I recognized. She thanked him quietly before walking into the house. The way they looked at each other made my stomach twist with unease. At that moment, I began to wonder if something far more serious was happening. The more I watched, the more uneasy I became. The mysterious car appeared several more times over the next month. It always arrived when my father was away on business. The same man sat behind the wheel each time. And each time my stepmother seemed very comfortable with him. One afternoon I watched from the upstairs window as she stepped out of the car. Before she closed the door, the man reached over and touched her hand. It wasn't the kind of gesture strangers make. My heart pounded as I stepped away from the window. I didn't want to believe what I was thinking. But the signs were difficult to ignore. I started paying closer attention. Sometimes she would leave the house claiming she had doctor appointments. But hours would pass before she returned. One evening my father mentioned something strange during dinner. "I called the clinic today," he said casually. My stepmother froze. "I wanted to ask about your next appointment." She forced a smile. "Oh, they rescheduled it earlier this week." My father nodded. But something in her eyes looked nervous. After dinner she rushed to her room and closed the door. That night I kept replaying everything in my mind. phone call, the secret car rides, the strange clinic visits, and the way she talked about inheritance. A terrible thought began forming in my mind. What if the baby she was carrying wasn't my father's child? I didn't want to believe it, but the possibility refused to disappear. And deep down, I knew something had to be uncovered. Weeks passed, and the tension inside the house slowly grew. My father remained happy about the coming baby. He talked about the future constantly. He even started making plans about updating his will. One evening I overheard him speaking with his lawyer in his office. "If the baby is a boy," my father said, "I want to make sure everything is equally protected for both children." My stomach tightened. So that was her plan. If she gave birth to a son, that child would share the inheritance. Maybe even take most of it. Suddenly her earlier words made perfect sense. Families need sons. That night I began paying closer attention to every detail. One afternoon I decided to follow her. She left the house around noon, saying she had another appointment. Instead of going toward the clinic, her car drove in a completely different direction, followed from a distance. After 20 minutes, the car stopped in front of a quiet apartment building. The same man stepped outside to greet her. They hugged. Not the kind of polite hug acquaintances give. It was the kind of hug that made my chest feel tight with anger. I stayed hidden behind another parked car while they walked inside the building together. They remained there for nearly 2 hours. When she finally returned home later that evening, she acted as if nothing unusual had happened. But now I knew. Something serious was happening behind my father's back. The only question left was how deep the truth really went. The discovery filled my mind with constant worry. For days I debated whether I should tell my father what I had seen. But without proof, my words might only create more problems. My stepmother was very good at pretending. If I accused her without evidence, she could easily turn my father against me. So I decided to wait. Instead, I started collecting small details. Car license numbers, phone conversations, every clue I could quietly gather. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon a letter arrived at the house. It was addressed to my stepmother. When I picked it up from the mailbox, the sender's name caught my attention. It wasn't from a clinic. It was from a private medical laboratory. Curiosity burned inside me. Later that evening I noticed the letter still sitting unopened on the hallway table. My stepmother hadn't seen it yet. My heart began racing. Carefully I picked up the envelope. For a moment I hesitated. Opening someone else's mail felt wrong. But the memory of everything I had seen pushed my hesitation aside. Slowly I opened the envelope. Inside was a medical report. And the words written on the first page made my hands start trembling. Because the document wasn't about pregnancy. It was about something else entirely. Paternity test. And the name listed as the possible father was not my father. My hands trembled as I stared at the document. The words on the paper were clear. It was a paternity test request form from a private laboratory. Under the section labeled possible father, a name was written that I did not recognize. It was not my father. For a moment I felt frozen in place. If the baby truly belonged to someone else, then everything my father believed was a lie. And my stepmother knew it. I carefully placed the report back inside the envelope and returned it to the table exactly where I found it. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think. That night during dinner, I watched my stepmother closely. She smiled while speaking to my father about baby clothes and nursery decorations. My father looked happier than I had seen him in years. He had always wanted a large family. Now he believed that dream was finally coming true. But every time my stepmother spoke, the memory of the document echoed in my mind. Later that evening she picked up the envelope from the hallway table. For a moment her face changed when she saw the sender's name. She quickly slipped the letter into her bag and walked toward her room. The next morning she left the house earlier than usual. Instead of going to the clinic, she drove to the same apartment building I had seen before. And the same man was waiting for her outside. This time I didn't need any more proof. But I still needed something stronger. Because if I told my father now, he might not believe me. I had to uncover the full truth, no matter how painful it would be. Over the next few weeks I watched everything carefully. My stepmother continued meeting the same man in secret. Sometimes they met at the apartment building. Other times they met at a small cafe across town. I took photos whenever I could without being noticed. Each picture added another piece to the puzzle. But one question still remained. Was the baby truly his? Or was I misunderstanding everything? Then one evening I overheard something that answered my question. My stepmother was speaking on the phone again. She was standing on the balcony, thinking no one could hear her. "Don't worry," she said quietly. "I told him the baby is his." I felt my stomach twist. Her voice continued. "Once the child is born, everything will be secure." There was a pause. Then she laughed softly. "Of course it will be a boy." I stepped away before she could see me. The words repeated in my mind again and again. Everything will be secure. So that was the plan. If the baby was a son, my father would include him in the inheritance. And no one would question where the child truly came from. I felt anger rising inside me. Not because of the money, but because my father trusted her completely. He believed she loved him. He believed the child was his. And she was using that trust to build a lie. A lie that could destroy our entire family. The months passed quickly as the pregnancy continued. My father became more excited every day. He began preparing a nursery room near his bedroom. He also talked often about the future. "Once the baby arrives," he said one evening, "this house will finally feel alive again." I forced a small smile. But the truth felt heavy inside me. By now I had collected several photos of my stepmother meeting the mysterious man. I also had a copy of the medical document from the laboratory. Still, I needed something stronger. Something that would make the truth impossible to deny. One afternoon my stepmother left her phone on the kitchen table while she went upstairs. The screen lit up with a message. Curiosity pulled me closer. The message preview showed only a few words. "Did you tell him about our son?" My heart nearly stopped. Carefully I opened the message. Several conversations appeared between her and the same number. The messages were clear. They spoke about the baby. They spoke about hiding the truth. And they spoke about inheritance. I quickly took photos of the messages with my own phone before placing her device back exactly where it was. My hands were shaking. Now I had something powerful. Something that proved the affair. Something that proved the baby might not belong to my father. But even with all this evidence, I still felt afraid. Because exposing the truth would change everything. And once it was revealed, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. As the pregnancy reached its final months, the tension inside the house grew stronger. My stepmother acted more confident than ever. She spent hours planning for the baby. Furniture. Everything had to be perfect. My father watched her with admiration. He truly believed she was building a happy future for our family. Meanwhile, I kept gathering evidence quietly. One evening something unexpected happened. The mysterious man arrived near our house again. But this time he didn't stay in the car. He walked toward the front gate. I watched from the upstairs window as he rang the bell. My stepmother quickly opened the door and stepped outside. They spoke for several minutes. Even from a distance, I could see the tension between them. Then he said something that made her expression change. She looked angry. Their conversation ended quickly, and he left. Later that night I heard her arguing on the phone. "You promised to stay away from the house," she said angrily. There was a pause. Then she continued. "No, you can't come here again." Another pause. Her voice became quieter. "Yes, I know the baby is yours." My chest tightened. That sentence confirmed everything. But it also meant something else. The man was becoming impatient. And when desperate people start making mistakes, the truth often comes out faster. The baby was born 2 weeks later. My father rushed to the hospital the moment the labor started. Followed shortly after. Several hours later, a nurse walked into the waiting room with a smile. "It's a boy," she announced. My father's face lit up with pure joy. He hugged me tightly. "I have a son," he said proudly. Inside the hospital room, my stepmother held the newborn child while my father stood beside her. The moment looked perfect from the outside. But something about the baby caught my attention. His features looked different. Very different. The shape of his face. The color of his hair. Even his eyes. For a moment I remembered the man who had been visiting her. The similarities were impossible to ignore. But my father didn't notice anything unusual. He was too happy. Too proud. Too hopeful. That night he announced something important. "I'm updating my will next week," he said. "My son will inherit everything alongside you." The words felt heavy in the room. My stepmother smiled quietly. She thought her plan had worked. But she didn't know something. I already had the evidence. And soon the truth would finally be revealed. After the baby arrived, the house changed completely. My father walked around with a smile that never seemed to disappear. He carried the baby everywhere and spoke proudly about finally having a son. Relatives visited almost every day. Everyone brought gifts and congratulated my father. My stepmother looked pleased with all the attention. She acted like the perfect mother in front of everyone. But when the house grew quiet, I noticed something different. Sometimes she stared at the baby with a strange expression. Almost like she was worried. One evening I heard my father talking on the phone in his office. "Yes," he said. "I want the will updated as soon as possible." My chest tightened. He continued speaking. "My son should have full protection in the inheritance plan." I stood outside the door listening carefully. Once the will was changed, everything would become much harder to fix. If the lie remained hidden, the baby would grow up believing my father was his real parent. And my father would continue living inside a false story. Later that night my stepmother made another secret phone call. I heard her voice from the hallway. "He's updating the will next week," she whispered. There was a short pause. "Yes. Everything is going exactly as planned." Her words sent a cold feeling through my chest. She believed she had already won. But she didn't know how much evidence I had collected. And soon, the truth would start pushing its way to the surface. Few days later something unexpected happened. While cleaning the living room, I heard someone knock on the front door. When I opened it, I froze. The same man who had been secretly meeting my stepmother stood outside. For a moment we both stared at each other. His eyes showed surprise. "Is she home?" he asked quietly. I crossed my arms. "She's resting upstairs." He shifted nervously. "I need to speak with her." Before I could respond, my stepmother appeared at the top of the stairs. The moment she saw him, her face went pale. She rushed downstairs quickly. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a low voice. "I told you not to come here." The man looked frustrated. "We need to talk." She glanced nervously toward the hallway where the baby was sleeping. "This is not the place," she said sharply. Their voices were low, but I could still hear enough to understand the tension. "I want to see my son," the man said. My stepmother's expression hardened. "You can't." He looked shocked. "You promised." She cut him off quickly. That promise was before things changed. The silence between them felt heavy. Finally she pushed him toward the door. "Leave. Now." The man looked angry as he walked away. But before leaving, he glanced back at the house. The look in his eyes told me something important. This story was far from over. That evening my stepmother looked unusually tense. She kept checking her phone and walking around the house restlessly. My father noticed her behavior. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. She forced a small smile. "I'm just tired." But I knew the truth. The man who claimed to be the baby's real father was starting to lose patience. And impatient people often make mistakes. 2 days later another strange event happened. A letter arrived at the house addressed to my father. It came from the same medical laboratory whose name I had seen earlier. My heart started beating faster. Why would the laboratory contact my father directly? I placed the letter on my father's desk without opening it. Later that evening I watched as he opened it. His expression slowly changed as he read the paper inside. "What is this?" he murmured. My stepmother looked up from the sofa. "What happened?" My father stared at the document with confusion. "It's from a medical lab," he said. "They're asking me to confirm a paternity test request." The room suddenly felt very quiet. My stepmother's face turned pale. For a moment she looked completely frozen. Then she forced a small laugh. "That must be a mistake." But my father continued reading. "The request was submitted months ago," he said slowly. My stepmother quickly stood up. "I'll call them tomorrow," she said. But the damage had already begun. The first crack in her lie had just appeared. The next morning my stepmother left the house very early. She claimed she needed to visit the laboratory to fix the mistake. But I knew she was panicking. My father looked confused the entire morning. He kept reading the letter again and again. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would anyone request a paternity test?" I stayed quiet. Part of me wanted to tell him everything immediately. But another part knew the truth needed to come out carefully. Without clear proof, my stepmother would simply deny everything. By afternoon she returned home looking calmer. "It was just a clerical error," she explained quickly. "The lab mixed up some records." My father looked relieved. But something in his eyes showed doubt. Later that night I noticed something unusual. My father walked into the baby's room and stood quietly beside the crib. He studied the child's face for a long moment. Then he slowly walked away without saying anything. The seed of doubt had been planted. And once doubt enters the mind, it rarely disappears easily. Meanwhile, I knew the final step was coming. Soon the truth would be impossible to hide. 3 days later my father received another phone call. This time it came directly from the laboratory. I watched from the hallway as he listened silently. His expression slowly turned serious. "Yes," he said finally. "I understand." After the call ended, he sat quietly for several minutes. Then he called my stepmother into the room. "I need to ask you something," he said calmly. She looked nervous. "What is it?" My father held up the phone. "The laboratory said the paternity test request came from your email." For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved quickly across the room. "That can't be right," she replied. But my father's voice remained steady. "They also said the possible father listed on the form was not me." The silence that followed felt heavy. I watched her carefully. Her calm mask was beginning to crack. And deep inside, I knew the moment of truth was getting closer. Very soon, the lie that started months ago would finally collapse. The room felt completely silent after my father asked his question. My stepmother stood frozen for several seconds. Her eyes moved from my father to the floor and then back again. "That must be a mistake," she finally said. Her voice sounded weak. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. "The laboratory confirmed the request came from your email address," he said. She shook her head quickly. "Someone must have hacked it." I could see the doubt growing on my father's face. He was not an angry man by nature, but he was very careful with the truth. And right now, the truth in front of him did not make sense. "Why would anyone request a paternity test using your email?" he asked calmly. She opened her mouth, but no answer came out. For the first time since she entered our family, she looked truly nervous. The silence stretched across the room. Finally she crossed her arms and said quietly, "I don't know." My father stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke again. "I think we should take a test ourselves," he said. The moment the words left his mouth, my stepmother's face turned pale. "A test?" she repeated. "Yes," my father replied. "Just to remove any doubt." Her eyes widened. But why would you doubt me? My father sighed softly. Because something about this situation feels wrong. That was the moment everything began to change. My stepmother tried to argue against the test. She said it was unnecessary. She said it was insulting. She even accused my father of not trusting her. But my father remained calm. If there is nothing to hide, he said, then the test will prove it. The conversation ended with quiet tension filling the room. Later that evening I heard my stepmother making another secret phone call. She spoke quickly and nervously. You said this would never happen, she whispered. There was a long pause as she listened. No, she continued. He wants a test now. Another pause. Her voice became sharp. Then fix it. After the call ended, she sat alone in the living room for a long time. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Her perfect plan was beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, my father scheduled the test for the following week. He told everyone it was simply a precaution. But I could tell the doubt inside him was growing stronger. That night he walked into my room quietly. I need to ask you something, he said. I looked up. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? For a moment I hesitated. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Slowly, I opened my phone and showed him the photos I had taken. Photos of my stepmother meeting the mysterious man. My father stared at the images in silence. His face slowly turned pale. The truth had finally begun revealing itself. My father said nothing for a long time after seeing the photos. He simply sat there, staring at the screen of my phone. The pictures were clear. My stepmother standing close to another man. Meeting him outside buildings. Entering apartments with him. Finally my father spoke. When did you take these? He asked quietly. Over the last few months, I replied. He closed his eyes for a moment. I wish you had told me earlier. I needed proof, I said softly. He nodded slowly. You were right. The next morning my father acted as if nothing had changed. He spoke to my stepmother normally during breakfast. But I could see something different in his eyes. The trust was gone. Later that afternoon the doorbell rang. When I opened the door I froze again. The mysterious man was standing there. But this time he didn't look calm. He looked angry. Is he home? The man asked. Before I could answer, my father walked into the hallway. The two men stared at each other in silence. My father's voice remained calm. Can I help you? The man hesitated for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. I'm here to see my son. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. Because my stepmother was standing behind my father. And her face had turned completely white. My father slowly turned toward my stepmother. Is that true? He asked quietly. She looked completely frozen. The man at the door crossed his arms. I'm tired of hiding, he said. That child is mine. My father's face became very still. For a moment no one spoke. Then my stepmother finally found her voice. Don't listen to him, she said quickly. He's lying. But the man shook his head. You promised I would be part of the child's life, he said. You said once the inheritance was secured, we could tell the truth. My father's eyes widened slightly. Inheritance, he repeated. The room felt like it was closing in around us. My stepmother looked desperate now. You're twisting everything, she shouted. But the man continued speaking. You said your husband wanted a son, he said. And that once the boy was born, everything would belong to him. My father slowly sat down in the nearest chair. The truth was unfolding right in front of him. Piece by piece. Lie by lie. And there was no way to stop it anymore. The argument that followed felt like a storm exploding inside the house. My stepmother shouted. The man shouted back. But my father remained silent. Finally he raised his hand. That's enough, he said calmly. The room went quiet. He looked at the man standing at the door. Are you willing to confirm this with a test? My father asked. The man nodded immediately. Of course. My father then turned to my stepmother. She looked defeated. Her shoulders slowly dropped. The mask she had worn for months was finally gone. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she whispered. My father's voice was steady but cold. "You planned everything." Tears filled her eyes. "I just wanted security." But the damage had already been done. Within minutes my father asked the man to leave. The door closed behind him quietly. My stepmother stood alone in the center of the room. And for the first time since she entered our lives, she had nothing left to say. The truth was finally standing in the open. And soon it would destroy the lie she had built. The days after the confrontation felt heavy and quiet. No one in the house spoke much. My stepmother stayed inside her room most of the time. The confident woman who once controlled everything now looked small and nervous. My father, on the other hand, became very calm. Almost too calm. 2 days later we went to the medical laboratory for the official paternity test. The mysterious man also arrived. When he walked into the waiting room, the tension returned immediately. My stepmother refused to look at him. My father spoke only when necessary. The test itself was simple. A nurse collected samples from the baby, my father, and the other man. Then we were told the results would take a few days. Those days felt like the longest week of my life. Even though the truth seemed obvious, everyone still waited for the final proof. At home the silence continued. My father spent most of his time in his office, reviewing business documents and speaking quietly with his lawyer. My stepmother tried to act normal, but the fear in her eyes never disappeared. One evening she approached my father. "Please," she said softly, "we can fix this." My father looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "Some things cannot be fixed." She started crying, but he simply walked away. For the first time I realized how deeply he had been hurt. The betrayal was bigger than money. It was about trust. And that trust had been completely broken. 3 days later the laboratory called. My father asked all of us to gather in the living room. Even the other man came. The atmosphere felt tense as we waited for the envelope containing the results. My father opened it slowly. For a moment he read the document in silence. Then he placed it on the table. "The results are clear," he said calmly. My stepmother closed her eyes. "The child is not mine." The words felt heavy in the room. No one spoke. Then my father looked at the other man. "You are the biological father," he said. The man nodded quietly. My stepmother started crying again. "I never wanted things to go this far," she whispered. But the truth had already arrived. There was no hiding anymore. My father stood up slowly. "This marriage is over," he said firmly. My stepmother looked shocked. "You can't do that," she said. "Yes," my father replied. "I can." He walked toward the door and opened it. "You should leave." She looked around the house desperately, as if hoping someone would stop him. But no one moved. The plan she created for inheritance had collapsed completely. And now the consequences were beginning. The divorce process started quickly. My father contacted his lawyer the very next day. Because the baby was not his child, the legal situation was simple. My stepmother had no claim to the inheritance. She tried to argue at first. She claimed she had made mistakes but still deserved support. But the evidence was too clear. The messages, photos, the paternity test. Every piece of truth stood against her. Within weeks the court finalized the separation. She moved out of the house soon after. The man who claimed to be the baby's real father began taking responsibility for the child. But their relationship also seemed uncertain. Trust was already broken between them too. Meanwhile the house slowly returned to normal. It felt quieter but also more peaceful. One evening my father and I sat together in the living room. "I'm sorry you had to see all of this," he said. I shook my head. "You deserved the truth." He nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes people do terrible things when money becomes their goal." He looked around the house quietly. "But family should never be built on lies." For the first time in months, I saw a sense of peace return to his face. The storm had finally passed. Months went by, and life slowly found a new rhythm. My father focused on his business again. He also spent more time at home. Sometimes we talked about the past, but not often. The experience had changed both of us. One afternoon he called me into his office. "I updated my will," he said. I looked at him quietly. He handed me a document. "I realized something important," he continued. "Money can cause many problems when people fight over it." He smiled slightly. "So I made sure everything is very clear now." The inheritance plan no longer left room for manipulation. He had protected his legacy carefully. But more importantly, he had learned a difficult lesson about trust. As for my stepmother, we heard very little about her after she left. Rumors said she moved to another city. The man who fathered the child struggled to support them. Their perfect plan had turned into a difficult reality. Sometimes lies promise easy rewards. But the truth always arrives eventually. And when it does, it changes everything. Looking back now, the entire experience feels unreal. At the time it felt like living inside a long storm. Secrets, lies, fear, and finally truth. My stepmother believed she could control the future by creating a lie. She thought a child would guarantee her access to my father's inheritance. But she forgot one important thing. Lies grow heavier over time. And eventually they collapse under their own weight. The day the truth was revealed changed all of us. My father learned to be more careful with trust. I learned how important it is to stand for truth, even when it feels difficult. And the woman who tried to manipulate our family lost everything she had hoped to gain. The house where everything happened now feels peaceful again. Sometimes I walk through the same hallway where I once opened that mysterious letter. That moment started the chain of events that revealed everything. If I had ignored that feeling of suspicion, the lie might have lasted much longer. But truth has a strange way of finding its path. No matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. And in the end, truth always wins. Even when it takes time.